The letter had promised a cook. What climbed down from the dusty stagecoach in front of the Whitmore Ranch that August afternoon in 1878 was a woman with hollow cheeks, a carpet bag with a broken handle, and a baby girl asleep against her hip. And the moment Nathaniel Whitmore saw the child's small fist curled into the woman's collar, he knew he would never be able to send either of them away. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in second chances, I ask you now, before this story even begins to unfold, to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Now, let us step back into the dust and sagebrush of the Montana Territory, where a lonely rancher's life was about to change forever. Nathaniel Whitmore was 34 years old, and he had buried more than most men buried in a lifetime. His wife, Sarah, had died 3 winters past, taken by a fever that swept through the valley and left him alone on 800 acres of grassland with nothing but cattle, silence, and grief for company. He had written the advertisement himself, in careful block letters, and sent it to a matrimonial and employment paper back east. Wanted, cook for ranch house, respectable woman, room and board provided, must be willing to travel to Montana Territory. He had not asked for a wife. He had asked, plainly and simply, for someone to keep his kitchen and his sanity, because he could no longer stomach his own burnt biscuits and the empty chair across the table. The letter that came back was signed Grace and Doyle, and it said nothing of a child. She had written of her skill with a Dutch oven, her steady hand with bread dough, her willingness to work hard for honest wages. She had not lied exactly. She had simply left out the truth, the way a woman learns to leave out the truths that might close a door before she ever reaches it. And so, when the stagecoach rattled to a stop in the little town of Copper Creek, and Nathaniel stepped forward with his hat in his hands to greet the woman he expected, he found himself instead staring at a baby no older than 8 months, her cheeks red from the heat, her small mouth working at nothing, hungry. Grace did not wait for him to speak first. She lifted her chin, though her eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from more than one sleepless night, and she said that she understood if he wished to put her back on the coach, that she would not blame him, that she had known the risk when she boarded in St. Louis with nothing but a dead sister's daughter and a promise she meant to keep. She said the baby's name was Ruth, and that Ruth's mother, her younger sister Mary, had died of childbed fever not 4 months before, and that there had been no one else, no father worth speaking of, no kin left living who could take the child in. She said all this fast, like a woman confessing a sin she had already decided she would not apologize for. And Nathaniel stood in the street with the wind kicking dust around his boots and found that he could not make his mouth form the words to turn her away. He told her, instead, that a cook who could not eat properly herself would not last a week in his kitchen, and that there was a spare room in the house that had once belonged to a child who was never born, and that Ruth was welcome to sleep in it. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was not even, strictly, kindness. Nathaniel would tell himself later that it was simple practicality, that a woman with a baby to feed would work harder to keep her position than one with nothing to lose. But the truth he did not admit even to himself for a long while, was that something in the sight of that small fist curled against Grace's collar had reached into the frozen place in his chest where Sarah's memory lived, and had cracked it open just enough to let a little light through. The ranch house sat 2 miles outside of Copper Creek, a sturdy structure of hewn logs and a wide front porch that looked out over rolling grassland toward the blue shoulders of the mountains. Nathaniel ran near 600 head of cattle with the help of 3 hired hands, a weathered old cowpuncher named Silas Turner who had ridden with Texas outfits before the war, a quiet young man called Josiah Bell who spoke little but worked from can't see to can't see, and a boy of 16 named Thomas Reed who was learning the trade and worshipped Nathaniel the way boys worship men who have survived hardship. None of them said a word when Grace stepped down from the wagon that evening with the baby on her hip, though Silas would later admit, over a plate of her cornbread, that he had never in 40 years of ranching seen a man look so thunderstruck as Nathaniel Whitmore had looked in that dusty street. The first weeks were not easy ones. Grace rose before dawn to start the stove, Ruth balanced on one hip while she kneaded dough with the other hand, and more than once Nathaniel found her weeping quietly over the wash basin when she thought no one was watching, the grief for her sister still raw and unhealed. He did not press her to speak of it. He had learned, in his own mourning, that grief was a thing a person had to walk through alone, even surrounded by others. And so he gave her the gift of silence when silence was needed, and the gift of an extra blanket when the nights turned cold, and the gift of teaching Ruth to laugh by making faces at her across the supper table until even Grace, red-eyed and weary, could not help but smile. It was Thomas, the young hired hand, who first said aloud what the others had begun to think, that Grace Doyle cooked like a woman who had learned hardship in a hard kitchen, using cheap cuts and stretching flour further than seemed possible, and that whatever sorrow lived behind her eyes, her hands never once slowed in their work. She sewed patches into the men's worn shirts without being asked. She kept a kitchen garden that by September was heavy with squash and beans. She sang to Ruth in a low, cracked voice while she hung the wash, old hymns her mother had taught her back in Missouri before hard times and harder men had scattered the family to the winds. And Nathaniel, watching from the barn door or the porch rail, found himself listening for that, singing the way a starving man listens for the sound of the supper bell. But the frontier gives with one hand and takes with the other, and trouble came to Copper Creek that autumn in the shape of a man named Wade Kessler, who ran a gang of rustlers out of the Badlands to the north, and had for 2 years been picking off cattle from the smaller outfits around the valley, always careful never to hit any one rancher hard enough to bring the full weight of the law down on him. Nathaniel had lost stock to Kessler before, a dozen head here, a dozen there, and like his neighbors he had grumbled and tightened his watch and gone on, because the sheriff in Copper Creek, a decent but aging man named Sheriff Amos Whitfield, had neither the men nor the resources to chase rustlers across 200 miles of broken country. What none of them knew, not even Sheriff Whitfield, was that Wade Kessler had once been another man entirely, a man named Wade Doyle, Grace's own husband, who had abandoned her in St. Louis 4 years before with nothing but debts and a black eye to remember him by, and had drifted west to remake himself into something harder and crueler than the man she had married. She recognized him the day he rode into Copper Creek to sell 3 horses at the livery, bold as brass beneath a false name, and the sight of him standing in the street in broad daylight nearly stopped her heart in her chest. She said nothing to Nathaniel that evening, though he noticed she went pale over supper and could not finish her plate, and it was not until 2 nights later, when Kessler's men struck the Whitmore herd and made off with 40 head under cover of a moonless sky, that Grace finally broke her silence and told Nathaniel the truth of who the rustler leader truly was. The confession cost her everything she feared it might. She told him she had been ashamed, that a woman who had once been fool enough to marry a man like that carried the shame of it long after he was gone, that she had hoped by changing towns and changing her circumstances she might also outrun the humiliation of her own poor judgment. Nathaniel listened to all of it on the porch in the dark, Ruth asleep inside, the crickets loud in the grass, and when Grace finished speaking she would not look at him, certain that this, finally, was the thing that would send her back to the stagecoach for good. Instead he reached over and took her rough, work-worn hand in his and told her that a woman was not responsible for the sins of a man she had once trusted, any more than he was responsible for the fever that had taken Sarah, and that the only shame in this valley belonged to Wade Kessler alone. But knowing who the rustler was changed nothing about the danger he posed, and in fact made it worse, because Kessler had also recognized Grace that day in town, and a man like that could not abide a witness who knew his true name walking free in a county with a sheriff's office. Word came within the week, carried by a frightened stable boy who had overheard rough talk in the saloon, that Kessler meant to ride out to the Whitmore place and settle accounts. Not just for the cattle, but for the woman who could unravel his new identity with a single word to the law. Sheriff Whitfield, informed of the threat, rode out himself with 2 deputized townsmen to stand watch, but he warned Nathaniel plainly that Kessler's gang numbered near a dozen guns, and that a rancher, 3 hired hands, and an aging sheriff would be sorely outmatched if it came to a real fight. The night Kessler came was a night Nathaniel Whitmore would remember for the rest of his life as the night the whole shape of his future was decided in the space of a single hour. They came at moonrise, 8 riders thundering out of the dark with torches and pistols, meaning to burn the barn and force Nathaniel out into the open where they could finish the business quickly. But Silas Turner, old as he was, had fought in worse fights than this one, and he had spent the day before quietly arming every man on the place and setting them in careful positions behind the corral fence and the well house. And when the riders came screaming out of the darkness, they rode straight into a crossfire that no one had warned them to expect. The fight was short and brutal, gunfire cracking against the vast silent dark of the Montana night, horses screaming, men shouting, and through it all Nathaniel fought his way toward the ranch house where Grace had barricaded herself and Ruth in the root cellar, his heart hammering with a fear more terrible than any he had known even in the war, because it was not his own life he feared for but theirs. Wade Kessler himself made it as far as the porch steps before Sheriff Whitfield's bullet caught him in the shoulder and spun him into the dirt, and there he lay, cursing and bleeding, until Nathaniel stood over him with a shotgun and the old lawman clamped iron around his wrists. 3 of the rustlers lay dead in the yard by the time the guns fell silent, and 2 more had been captured, while the rest scattered into the darkness, never to trouble Copper Creek again. Nathaniel himself had taken a graze along his ribs that would leave a scar he'd carry the rest of his days. But he was alive, and when he pulled open the cellar door and found Grace inside with Ruth clutched to her chest, both of them trembling but unharmed, he felt something break loose in his chest that had been frozen there since the day they buried Sarah. Wade Kessler was tried in the territorial court that winter and sentenced to hang for murder and cattle theft. A sentence Grace received not with vengeful satisfaction, but with a quiet, exhausted grief for the ruin a man could make of his own life. She wept that night, not for the man he had become, but for the boy he might once have been before whatever hardness had taken hold of his heart. And Nathaniel, sitting beside her at the kitchen table with Ruth asleep between them in a basket, understood that her tears were the mark of a good heart rather than a foolish one, and he loved her a little more for shedding them. It was not a dramatic proposal that came that spring, no bent knee in the parlor, no rehearsed speech. It came instead on an ordinary morning in April, with the ground thawing and the first green showing through last year's dead grass. When Nathaniel found Grace out by the garden fence teaching Ruth, now walking on unsteady legs, to say the word flower while pointing at the first crocus of the season. He stood watching them for a long moment. The woman who had come to his ranch expecting only wages and had instead rebuilt his whole broken heart from the inside out. And he said, without any preamble at all, that he had been thinking it was foolish for a man and woman to run a household together as strangers when neither of them wished to be strangers any longer, and that he would be honored, more honored than he had words to say, if she would consent to be his wife in truth and not merely in the eyes of the ranch hands who already called her Mrs. Whitmore out of habit and hope. Grace, with Ruth's small hand still clutched in hers and tears standing bright in her eyes, said only that she had been waiting for him to ask since the night he pulled open that cellar door, and that she could not imagine spending whatever years God gave her anywhere but at his side. They were married in June, in the small white church in Copper Creek, with Silas Turner standing as witness and weeping unashamedly into a handkerchief he claimed was only for his allergies, and Ruth, dressed in a small white gown Grace had sewn by lamplight, toddling up the aisle ahead of the bride to scatter wildflower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Sheriff Whitfield gave the bride away, since there was no father left living to do it, and the whole town turned out afterward for a supper on the church lawn, tables groaning with food that Grace herself had spent 3 days preparing because old habits, she said laughing, died hard. In the years that followed, the Whitmore Ranch became known throughout the valley not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the kindness of the family that ran it. A family built not by blood alone, but by grief transformed into grace, by a rancher who had learned that love could arrive disguised as an advertisement for a cook, and by a woman who had learned that the family she feared she'd lost forever could be rebuilt from strangers willing to open their hearts and their homes. Ruth grew up calling Nathaniel Papa, without ever knowing another word for it. And when she was old enough to understand the story of how she came to that ranch on her aunt's hip, she would ask to hear it again and again, the way children do with the stories that shape who they become. Before we close this story, I want to ask you, wherever you are watching from tonight, to leave a comment below and tell me your city, your state, or your country, and share with all of us the lesson this story left within your heart. Perhaps it taught you that kindness shown to a stranger can return to you tenfold, or that the family we build with open hands is every bit as real as the family we are born into, or that grief, however heavy, does not have to be the end of the story. Whatever lesson found you tonight, I would be honored to read it in your words. And if this story of Nathaniel and Grace, of a cook who arrived as a stranger and left as a wife, of a baby girl who healed 2 broken hearts without ever knowing she was doing it, touched something tender in your own heart tonight, then I ask you one final time to like this video, leave your comment below, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances today, and subscribe so that more stories of faith, courage, and the enduring kindness of the human heart can find their way to you. May you carry a little of Copper Creek's hard-won grace with you into whatever tomorrow holds.